In this segment, we actually have two individuals. Really excited to have Ashley Jameson, who's the International Women's Groups Coordinator for Pure Desire Ministries. She helps churches around the world develop sexual integrity groups and oversees all women regional group advisors. She's also a speaker and an author. We also have Heather Kolb, who is the content manager and neuroscience professional for Pure Desire Ministries. She has a Bachelor of Science in Psychology and a Master of Science in Criminal Behavior. She worked several years as a college professor prior to joining Pure Desire. She's a part of their speaking team, and along with Ashley, also helped to write the book Unraveled, Managing Love, Sex, and Relationships. Ladies, thank you for being part of the She Summit.
Yes, thank you for having us. We're really excited to be here.
Nice to be here.
I was telling them before we even hit record that this is the only session that we have two other speakers, not just one and me, but two and me here. So we have, more bang for the buck, I guess, in this session, which is exciting. I'm happy to have Pure Desire Ministries also a part of our summit as a sponsor and a partner, which is really exciting as well. So for each of you, I want you to take a moment and share with our audience, how and why you got passionate about the area of healthy sexuality. And Heather, we'll start with you in this question.
So I was raised in the church and raised in a healthy Christian home, not perfect Christian home, but really raised my whole entire life going to church, was married young, and really after my first divorce, it was evident that I didn't really know anything about sex or healthy sexuality, or really I probably could count the number of times that I ever achieved orgasm in my first marriage, because it wasn't something that I even really knew very much about, or, any of those things. And so when I came on board with Pure Desire, it really was still this issue that in the church, we just don't talk about this. We don't talk about sex or healthy sexuality, even, preparing women for what that looks like. And really with Ashley and I on the speaking team, it's surprising sometimes the questions we would get from married women who would, talk to us about, okay, well, I never achieve orgasm. I don't even like sex. I don't even, know how to talk with my spouse about sex. And so really that became my passion, is to just really help to educate women on that sex is good and that God gave us sex. And really for women, we buy into that lie that sex is just for men, and it's not, that our brain and our bodies need sex too. And it's good for bonding and all these other great things that come from having a really healthy, intimate, sexual relationship with our spouse. But even just for us, what does our sexuality look like? For us day to day, how do we raise our kids with a greater understanding of what healthy sex is? I think that's part of why I'm passionate about what we do here at Pure Desire.
Thank you, Heather. Yeah, it's a compelling story, and definitely something that's important to be talking about. And I definitely want to dive into that a little bit later. But what is healthy sexuality, and how do we get to a place where we don't see sex as dirty, but something that is how God made us in the right context, of course, as well. Ashley, how about you?
Well, first of all, I just wanted to say that having Heather and I together, I feel like is an extra bonus, because we work so well together. We love co-teaching, and the sun is really bright. I have my curtains closed, but the sun is super bright right now. We just love working together because, as we always say, Heather understands so much of the brain and has had some personal experience with her marriage, her first marriage and her second marriage, and just what she's learned in Pure Desire. And then I've had a lot of experience, I say in the streets, with my past, and Heather has helped me make so much sense of that. And so together we love teaching kind of just from both angles, what it looks like in relationship and in real life and experience, and then, what's going on inside our brain and how do we need to heal. And so we love co-teaching. It's one of our favorites. I got involved with Pure Desire about 6 years ago, because my husband's sexual addiction came out, and he was struggling with a pornography addiction. And then in the past had a couple of years struggle with prostitutes and affairs and things like that. We had both been married before. And so that really just shook my world and brought me into trying to get healing for myself through that betrayal trauma. But what I learned when I was doing that was that I had a whole bunch of stuff that I had not dealt with from my past. And so I just started digging into that for myself, and kind of part of what stirred the creation of Unraveled was Heather and I doing all this traveling and speaking for the last, 5 years, almost 5 years this fall. And just not only hearing other women's stories and how they may, like Heather said, maybe have been married for 40 years and never experienced orgasm, or maybe they've never stepped out on their marriage, but they still struggle with pornography or masturbation or fantasy, just so much unhealth. And it didn't look black or white. It wasn't always women stepping out and having affairs or just porn. There was these other things as well, masturbation without porn, or fantasy, or flirting, or just failed relationship after failed relationship. And so seeing all of that, and then also working through my own story, just made us realize we needed a resource that helped all women gain sexual health, whether it's pornography or fantasy or whatever it may be. And so that's where kind of Unraveled came from. We get to use a lot of personal questions that we've heard from ladies. And in my own story, I was raped as a virgin at 15, but because I felt so invisible and neglected in my life already at that point, from racial issues and having a mom who was working all the time and a dad that wasn't in the house, they were divorced, I felt like damaged goods, but then I also felt for the first time pursued. And so it was this conflict in me when I was raped by that older adult male. And from there, it just started this path of seeking attention through sex. And so I would say at the core, I'm really a love addict. I was just desperate to feel loved because I didn't feel that at school with the kids who were racist. My family wasn't around. I was just kind of this latchkey kid. And I wanted love so bad that I was willing to do anything sexual to get it. And so I did pursue sex with men. I ended up getting pregnant my senior year of high school with my twin boys, who are now 17, and we'll be starting their sexual video course this week with our Pure Desire Sexual Integrity 101 with my teen boys and their friends this week. And so just seeing the full circle of being a teen mom, pursuing love through sex, and then having my own addiction to masturbation. I dabbled in porn a little bit, but it was really just seeking love through men and then struggling with masturbation. And it wasn't until my husband's issue came out and I asked him to stop these things that I realized I should probably stop them too. So we kind of just, worked on that together. But that's what made me recognize that as a Christian woman who, when I got married and I stopped all those bad behaviors, I wasn't sleeping around, I wasn't looking at porn, I wasn't drinking, I had an eating disorder, all these things that were bad. I stopped all those, and I didn't see how in my Christian marriage there was still so much unhealth with trust issues, hypervigilance, still was masturbating even though I wasn't using porn, and other things that were eroding my marriage and I couldn't really see. And so I have a passion not only to help women who are struggling with the black and white obvious things like porn and sex and teen pregnancy and whatever their addiction is, and then also the women who may not even recognize that they have some behaviors that are unhealthy, that are keeping their relationships in not the greatest place, whether it's romantic or friendships or with God.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that and sharing vulnerably about your own personal stories. So I guess this is a question for both of you, and you guys can fight over who gets to answer it first. How did you come to learn what healthy sexuality is, and how do you define that?
Heather, you, me, we usually tackle it from two angles usually. I guess I'll start and then Heather can add in, and we love doing it that way. Healthy sexuality, I realized through all this recovery process, when I quit masturbating, I realized that had a bigger impact on me than I thought. But the unfortunate part is sometimes you don't realize how much it impacts every area of your life until you stop. And then you look back and you see, wow, I'm so much healthier. in all areas because I don't have this thing controlling me anymore. And so that can be the hard part with teaching women and teens and, preventatively, that trust me, it's so much better if you don't do these things. And that's sometimes why we just see women and, come in when they're at the bottom, when something has exploded. And so we're there for that. And that's usually who we see come in. But then we also have this passion to keep growing and figuring out how we can reach women before they get to that point. And I'm sure, Crystal, you probably see a lot of the same thing. But healthy sexuality in marriage, John and I had thought we did reach sexual health because we were no longer sleeping around, check the box. We weren't looking at porn. We weren't sleeping around. We weren't doing these things. But then the more you become emotionally aware of your thoughts and your feelings, the more you recognize that you're maybe not as vulnerable as you need to be, or you're not as intimate as you should be. And so just becoming more aware of thoughts and feelings, which are some of our tools in our workbook, helped me realize that I still had so much work to do, even though these black and white check boxes were, all clicked, that when I'd get intimate with John, I still would feel sometimes used, sometimes betrayed, sometimes not good enough. And so getting to those second and third and fourth layers of issues past the behaviors was really where we started to see how good our relationship could be once we were working on those areas.
Yeah, that is so good. And it's one of those things too that I don't know if you can absolutely say that, without having a really broad definition of sexual health, of healthy sexuality. I don't know if there is absolutely one single definition, but I do think that when we talk about healthy sexuality, we're talking about, what does that mean for us as women, because it's part of our identity, and so many of us have experienced abuse and trauma and these other factors that end up kind of shifting our view of sex. Even if as a child, if a little girl, has her hand in her pants and her parent says, "Oh, don't do that, that's dirty," that stays with them for their lifetime. You know what I mean? And that right there, that experience then ends up shaping their view of sexuality. And so I think that really when it comes to understanding what that looks like, even just for a single woman or for a teen woman or for somebody in marriage, it really does encompass all of these different things. How we feel about our own sexuality, how we express that as being female or being women, and then how do we communicate that, and how do we use that, or how does that come out in the way that we parent or in relationships. And like Ashley even said, not just romantic relationships, but how does it come out in the way we respond to other girlfriends, or you know what I mean? And so it really is this big, huge definition that doesn't come down to a single checkbox, but really is how do we live our lives in a way that every single day we're aware of our sexuality, that God created it, that it's good, and then how do we live that out in a healthy way. And I know that probably doesn't give you a definition, but that's kind of what we tried to do in Unravel, is to say, okay, your behavior is really just a symptom of maybe the way that you were raised to how to be in relationship. And maybe that wasn't something that was healthy in your family. And so let's look at your family and your attachment style and the way that you communicate or the way that you process emotions. And let's see what that looks like when you are living your life as a woman. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I have much more to unpack in that too. I'll start out with Ashley. One of the things that you mentioned was you're married currently, yes, to your husband. Yes. And so one of the things you brought up was masturbation. A lot of women, I see this a lot in our community, women that I work with, they think that if your sexual fulfillment isn't happening with your husband, then masturbation is okay. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think if your sexual fulfillment with your husband isn't working, then there's some stuff to be worked on. And so that's definitely my take. We know that the jury's split on whether masturbation's okay, if it's not involving porn, if it's not involved, those kinds of things. But I because I was that person, not only did I have the sexual trauma from curiosity with other kids and the sexual acting out, and the porn, but my primary thing in marriage was the masturbation without porn. And so I can speak to that. It does affect your brain. And that's kind of what we tell, people that ask us that, is it okay if it's mutual? And not to say that there's a straight answer for that, because we know that things can happen physically or, as people age, or that there can be certain circumstances where husband and wife has to get creative and they may need to figure out how to please each other sexually in a different way. But if you are in the habit of masturbating, and especially if it's something where it's keeping you from sexual health with your spouse, or something that you've wanted to stop, or anything like that, then that's really something to be looked at, because it does take away. It's like having a hose with a leak in it and some sideways energy going out that I didn't recognize until I had stopped masturbating, that it was taking away from my spouse. I didn't think so, because we had a pretty good sex life. I mean, we had sex regularly. We enjoyed each other. We were both reaching orgasm. It didn't seem like it was causing any problems, but it definitely does take away from that experience with your spouse. And Heather always explains in our conferences that when we orgasm, we bond to whatever it is that we're experiencing orgasm with, or for male, it causes them to protect. And so it does take away when our bond is supposed to be together. And then for the single person, I would say that you are definitely training your brain to respond a certain way, because I was single for 4 years before I married John. And in that time, it was fantasy novels, sexual movies, pornography, masturbation. And what that does is it puts these expectations and perceptions of what sex should be with your spouse into your head. And so it does cause you to not be able to be fully engaged and fully present with your spouse, because you have all these ideas. For a lot of women I talk to that are married, they've controlled their fantasy enough to where the fantasy is about their spouse. But the problem is they're still not in the moment with their spouse. They're still having to use fantasy in order to connect, in order to reach orgasm. So they're still detaching from the in-person experience with their spouse. And so all of these little areas that women don't often see until they start hearing other women talking about it. And they're like, wow, I do that. Why, when I married John, did I have to imagine that he was violently throwing me down on a bed or wherever in order to get excited? That's not healthy to imagine my husband being violent with me to get excited. But where did that come from other than the fantasy, the TV, the movies, the porn? And so it does snowball effect into our relationships, whether we're single or married.
Yeah, and would you agree that when in marriage, I mean, obviously masturbation, like you said, there's different rules of thought on the yes and no, is it a sin, etc. But would you agree that in marriage, anything that's done in secret that the other spouse doesn't know about is potentially a risk factor for other potential issues?
Yeah, 100%. I feel like secrets are so unhealthy. And to piggyback off of what Heather was saying with our how do we identify sexual health, when there's shame or secrecy wrapped around anything, it's going to affect us in all ways. And that's why we're so adamant about touching on all those areas, because we're not meant to live with secrets. And those secrets are what cause shame. And shame is what drives more addiction. And so it's going to cause separation, because then anytime anybody gets close to you and gets close to that secret, you're going to act differently. You're going to back off. You're going to withdraw, because you don't want people coming close to that secret. And so you're automatically taking away the true authenticity and vulnerability that a marriage is supposed to have.
Yeah. Thank you. So Heather, a little bit on the same thread. I know you were talking about your own story of lack of sexual fulfillment or an orgasm in marriage. I know that there's a lot of married women who are watching this right now who, while they're in addiction and there's compulsive issues that obviously need to be worked on, there's also real concerns about the fact that their husband is not fulfilling them sexually in terms of orgasm. And so they're taking it into their own hands, so to speak, to get that gratification. Can you speak to that and maybe give some advice to the woman who is struggling with that specific area?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that happens, and I don't know if this just happens naturally in a marriage, but I think that when I remember in my first marriage, when we were first married, things were fine, things were good, but then it seemed like, probably my body changed, or I wanted something more, but then I didn't ever risk saying physically as we started to drift apart. Then there wasn't, I don't know, I didn't feel like I could, bring it up this much late, or and really, I don't think that I ever really knew my own body enough to say, this is what I like, this is what I want, those kind of things. And I think that there's so much risk in that sometimes women just think, okay, that's too hard of a conversation to have with my husband, and so I'm just going to take care of things by myself, and and just let him think that everything is great with our sexual relationship. And I think that you kind of have to choose which is worse. You know what I mean? Do you risk having that conversation and even, doing some research? Because there's a lot of really good resources out there that help women in a real practical way understand their erogenous zones and some of these other things that help them achieve orgasm. And even like at a women's conference, we were talking about this, and I said, okay, if you went to your husband and said, I would like to explore this, and because I would like for us to have better sex, do you want to help me out with this? I don't know really very many guys who would say, no, I don't really want to do that. That they would be totally on board to say, yeah, let's figure this out. I want you to enjoy our sex life so much better, and yes, I'm going to help you figure this out. But I think that, again, it takes that risk and that vulnerability and asking for help, and sometimes I just think that you just have to choose. Okay, do I want to stay in this relationship and have our sex life be what it is, or do I want something better?
Yeah, that's really, really helpful. Thank you, Ash. Thank you, Heather. Sorry. So, Heather, you can be part of one of our panels on trauma and abuse during the summit. Can you talk with us about the impact of trauma that it has on the brain, but then subsequently the effect that has on addiction and healing?
Yeah. And that is really, again, a tough area, because I think that there's a lot of women who have experienced trauma and abuse. And for some women, it might have been just a one-time event, but it was so devastating. And then for other women, it's been a more frequent event, and it's been so devastating. And so there's a lot of other things that come into play in the way that affects our brain and especially our sexual behavior. But I think that for a lot of women, that trauma, when they're impacted by that, and especially if it's a form of sexual abuse, that experience alone kind of sets in motion this reaction in their brain to almost any sexual experience. And so even for women who have unprocessed trauma, they get married thinking that, okay, this is going to fix this, or I'm going to find the right guy, or, that kind of thing. And then they come to find out that, okay, those alarms in my head are still going off, even though I know that this is good and I love this person and everything's supposed to be right with this. And yet they haven't healed their brain enough to fix some of those triggers or the effect of that trauma so that they can pursue that relationship with a better sense of health. Does that make sense? Yeah, it really can be quite devastating, I think, to a marriage relationship, but almost any other relationship, because I think, Ashley, you had mentioned that as people get close to that secret, then you're going to protect that secret, even though that secret is really hurting you in the long run.
Yeah, I always give a few examples of this, that if we don't process the trauma, like I said, I had sexual experiences with other children that there wasn't any perpetrator. It was kids being sexually curious with each other, and then it going really far. But you carry that shame into your adulthood, and if you don't process that and get over the not like get over it, but like if you're not able to get over it through these healing processes, it's going to affect your parenting. It's going to affect everything. And so, and then experiencing the rape that I had and the very unhealthy experiences I had in high school before I was pregnant, they affected my marriage. And I've told this story before that, there was a time where my husband came up behind me and kissed me on the cheek. And I mean, we'd been married for years and we love each other and we have a lot of fun together. And I just like shivered and freaked out and started crying. And he's like, well, what is that? And I couldn't figure it out. And it wasn't until I was, working through a resource that's for teen girls. And it was, it was kind of taking me back to those high school days. And I realized, wow, every kiss I've ever had, first of all, my parents didn't like kiss me or say I love you. We didn't really do that stuff growing up. And then kisses up until my marriage were always very aggressive, very violent. A guy pursuing, wanting something more from me, so me having to like fight him off. And so they've always carried this negative thing with them. And I've had to really work to retrain my brain to be able to say that this is good, this is healthy. And then that shame that I carried from sexual curiosity with other kids, I worked through that in group as well after all of the betrayal stuff and when I got into my own healing. And I'm so happy that I did, because right after I had worked through that, my daughter, who was, I think she was 8 at the time, she's 10 now, she was at a neighbor kid's house that I know. Their family goes to church. All of these neighborhood girls have been playing forever. I don't even allow sleepovers because of my own trauma. But she's just been over there for a couple hours, and I walked to get her, and we were holding hands and walking back, and she said, I don't feel safe there, Mom. I have to tell you what happened. And these girls were saying, you have to kiss us. We have to switch gum. We have to make out. And she was not comfortable with that, but she did it. And then so when she came home and told me that, I ended up talking to the other parents, and I had found out that these girls had been doing sexual things for over a year long. And that was Ayla's first exposure to that. But she told me right away. She did something and she told me right away. And then I was able to talk to their parents, help get that little girl counseling, and also be able to say that, this is not healthy, but it's nothing to be ashamed of. And actually it's somewhat common with women when they're little girls, but nobody talks about it. And so these little girls feel so ashamed. And so to be able to talk to other people and say, this is not healthy, but you're not the only person who's experienced it. And you don't have to feel like you're the worst person in the world, or that every other Christian woman you look at church has made better choices than you and has more validity to be teaching women, because they probably didn't do these things when they were younger. And you'd be surprised how much women have gone through and how they're carrying that all on their own.
Yeah. Well, my next question is for both of you. We'll start with Heather. What are some tangible first steps a woman can take just even today who's dealing with trauma in order to take some first steps of healing?
So I would always recommend that women get counseling, because there's just some things that, and I love our group resources, and I think they're so powerful, but I think that sometimes in a professional setting that women feel a little bit more free to disclose something and even work on that a little bit before they get into group. And just because I think too that that our brain, when our brain has been damaged because of trauma, we sometimes think that we can fix it on our own, but we can't fix it with the same broken brain. We need to be able to give it to somebody else who has a healthy brain, who then is going to give it back to us in a way that makes sense and help us through that healing process. So I'm just a huge advocate of counseling, but then of course I also really believe in Unraveled, our group resource it can be really healing as well.
Ashley?
Yeah, and for me, probably because, we all find our healing different ways. And so for me, there wasn't anybody that I knew to talk to at the time when I was going through everything. And also we didn't have any extra money, like zero. So counseling was not an option for us at the time. And so for us, it was just starting groups or getting involved in a group and at least having that experience of going through something with other people. Because the one thing I think that we can all agree on is you can't fix this by yourself. And as Christian women, that's hard to understand sometimes. Like, well, why can't I just work through this with Jesus? He heals everything. It's forgiven. It's in the past. But we don't understand that even though it's forgiven and it's in the past, that the experience is still affecting our mind and our body and the way we interact with other people. And like Heather said, we can't fix that with our own broken brain. And so we have to have other people. And so counseling or just getting involved in a group that's specific about these issues so that you can just start the conversation, start hearing other women talk about it, start hearing a counselor who has expertise in this area walk you through it and tell you where maybe you're missing something or there's an area that needs to be explored more.
Yeah, thank you. So, Ashley, you're going to be part of a panel as well on accountability, which in large part is about healthy community, being a part of healthy community. Can you talk with us about the benefits and importance of groups and being a part of a safe community in order to heal?
Yeah, in some of our resources we talk about, and in our conference, in the Sexual Integrity 101 video course, we talk about how when we're sharing our story in a safe environment, that it actually changes the way our brain thinks and feels about things. And so that I'm sure we've all had an experience where we've heard something, smelled something, said something, did something, and it just creates this physical reaction in our body, whether we get a knot in our stomach or nauseous or my heart races or I'm sweating or whatever it is. And when we have those feelings that are associated with some of our trauma, they tend to still direct us and rule us, whether it makes us pull back, whether it makes us want to medicate and not feel those things, or shut down or get super angry, however we respond. And a lot of times we don't know how we do those things because we're not aware. But it does have an impact on you if it hasn't been dealt with. And so we teach that when you share your story in a safe environment and you're processing verbally out loud, which you normally don't do by yourself, and you're hearing other people, that it just brings together all these neural networks in our brain and integrates things so that it files it away a different way. And Heather always teaches in our conferences that our memories and our feelings are stored so closely together that they really impact each other. And so when we're able to process it out loud, it can help neutralize those feelings that are stored with the memory. And then I can look back and say, yes, I was raped at 15. Yes, I had a sexual addiction, OCD, eating disorder, without being a blubbery mess or feeling so anxious that somebody is hearing what I'm saying. And I can know those things were terrible and hard and they're part of my past, but they don't rule how I function anymore. And so we have to be in group. And if we're struggling with addiction, we need that accountability. We need to be meeting once a week so we can make traction. And then soon we look back and we say, I can't believe I'm here. I never thought I would have got here. We need somebody to be able to bring us where they've been before and show us that there is freedom from these things.
And that's so true. That was my personal experience. One Christian woman shared her story with me. I was able to enter into recovery, have accountability with her, and go to counseling, get the help I needed from my own trauma. Even as little T trauma as it was still trauma for me. It was still things that I was using, pornography, masturbation, etc., to medicate. And so, yeah, those are all very, really helpful tips and tricks. Thank you. So let's kind of wrap up by talking about Unraveled a little bit more. This is kind of a question for both of you. You can fight over who wants to answer it. But tell us a little bit more about Unraveled and what somebody who reads that book or that curriculum would expect to see.
Yeah, well, Unraveled is for such a wide variety of women that want to experience sexual health. And one of the areas that I think can be underlooked as far as a woman coming into this is the woman who avoids sex or doesn't enjoy sex or has trauma around sex, not just the hyper, but the hypo, and that all sexual dysfunction like that comes from the same area. And so we're just striving towards sexual health, whether you're on this end or that end, that we want to figure out what kind of intimacy issues and sexual, thoughts you have so that you can get to a place of health. I really like Unraveled because the last group I led had me in it, which you've heard some of my story. It's had women who were struggling with fantasy or affairs or pornography, same-sex attraction. You can have such a wide variety of women in a group, and they're all going to get what they need out of it. They're all going to figure it out. Like you're saying, Crystal, that your trauma may not have looked as big as some others, but all the lies, the pain, the coping, those are the things that look really similar. And it doesn't really matter what your acting out behavior is or even what your trauma is, because the women are going to have that connection on the lies they hear, how it affects them, how they get out of that pain. And so that's what's really cool, is that it can be a variety of women going through the group.
Yeah, I really like Unraveled for a lot of the same reasons, because we did really try to make the door a little bit wider, not just to say that, okay, if you struggle with love or sex addiction or porn, that this will help you, but really just to look at how it is that women, even just in general, how do we struggle, like with self-care, or even if we've gotten to a point where we're not masturbating anymore, but now every time life gets stressful, we're running to the cupboard, you know what I mean? And so just looking at food and exercise and all of these different things that impact women, I think that is really helpful. And I also love the way that it helps us over time understand our identity in Christ, that really we have a tendency to take on these other identities that serve our purpose in the moment, but really they end up not being very fulfilling. And even if they meet a need for us in the moment, that really our identity and who we are holistically, that comes from Christ. And so we really try and broach all of those topics in that how can we be healthy, not just sexually, but mentally and physically and emotionally and spiritually? What does that look like to have a healthy lifestyle?
Awesome. It sounds wonderful. How can those who are interested learn more about it, Ashley?
You can go to our website, puredesire.org, and there's tabs at the top, and you can either find a group. We have groups that are ran from local churches, and then we also offer Pure Desire online groups that are led by experienced leaders, and they're closed groups. That means that once you join, it will stay closed in a small group of 4 to 6 women, sometimes 4 to 7. And they're longer groups, and that's just because, as we've all experienced probably, it takes a long time to renew your brain and renew your habits and renew your thinking. And so they are longer groups because these women will walk through life together as they gain health. We also have free podcasts. We have several podcasts about Unraveled. We have podcasts about leading Unraveled, women in sex, and love, sex, and dating for the single woman or the divorced woman who may need more information. And then we also have regional group advisors that we connect women with if they're wanting to start their own group out of their home or their church. And we will help you figure out what it looks like to lead. The nice thing is the workbook and the weekly tools that go together, it's all packaged together. So if you have any kind of determination and leadership skills, you can just get a few friends together and at least start walking through it and starting that conversation with each other.
That's awesome. Thank you very much. I offer groups as well, but I can't lead them all. So it's awesome that there's other resources out there that women can be a part of and really just join today and be a part of. So thank you both for sharing and being a part of our summit. This has been really helpful information that I know will help a lot of women. So thank you.
Yes, thank you for having us here.